Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools and Beyond the Headlines. A wave of political change is sweeping across Latin America, from Panama to Chile, Honduras to Peru, and even Mexico. Left-wing politicians are sweeping aside centre-right and right-wing governments. The latest in line is likely to be Colombia, where elections take place at the end of this month. And that's our focus today. Our guests are Megan Janetsky, a photojournalist based in Bogotá who writes for Al Jazeera, the National Geographic and BBC. Hello, Megan. Away from Megan. And we've also got Joe Parkin Daniels, a correspondent with the New York Times and also The Guardian. And Joe is our expert for our political tours in Colombia, and a very good one too. Hello and welcome, Joe.
Morning.
Sporting a new haircut, especially for today's show. There is a huge amount to discuss. The world is heading into uncertain times, as I think we all know, with questions about food supplies, oil price hikes, inflation setting in. But we've already seen some of the political uncertainty play out in Latin America, and it's also in the wake, of course, of the pandemic. So our focus is on Colombia and the election, which takes place at the end of the month. And also, needless to say, much of this relates to the conflict that Colombia experienced with the FARC. And there was a peace agreement that really didn't come properly into effect just over 5 years ago. Joe, let's talk about the elections. Let's give some political context. And what I want to do is start with the current president, Ivan Duque, who was elected in 2018, I think. And that was part of a sort of more right-wing movement, perhaps a bit more like Brazil, not perhaps quite Bolsonaro-like, but very much in that sort of populist vein, and a move against the peace agreement. There'd been a referendum about the peace agreement, which actually the peace deal was seen to fail, and people are against it. And Duque was part of this move against that. Tell us a bit more about him.
So he, when he came into power 4 years ago, was a relative political novice. He's part of a party and system that is right-leaning, and parts of it are hard right, and has long been opposed to the peace deal with the FARC, which it sees as being too lenient on former rebels who committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, and is seen as being, taken particular disagreement with elements of the peace deal that guarantee former FARC combatants seats in Congress. He came to power on a campaign that was actually running against Gustavo Petro, who is this leftist who is now the front runner this time out. Duque was seen largely as a moderate within his party and a technocrat, though it was the perception of his performance over the last 4 years has been one of being largely controlled to some degree or other by his party, and without the political space and the political capital to really break from it, and therefore has been seen as being guilty of some of his party's kind of worst excesses, high-handedness, and non-implementation of the peace deal with the rebels, which has seen upticks in violence. And all of this kind of came to its head about a year ago in mass protests.
I'm going to stop you there, because when we came and did that trip with you, I think it was 2017. There was, for me, was it 2017 or 2018? It was 2018, I think. There was this huge shock for me that the referendum had gone against the peace process. And Duque, in a way, was part of that sense that, listen, we want more war and order. Okay, it's fine that there's a peace process, but these people are being given too much. And so he seemed to have a sort of a secure ground base of support, at least certainly within the sort of metropolitan, the city areas. But there's a sense of also discontent that he's failed to deliver on those promises, and that came to a head last year in May.
Exactly right. So he obviously promised, as all politicians do on the campaign trail, you're going to be wealthier, less less money will be taken from your pockets. Everything will get safer, etc., etc. With the curveball of the pandemic, which pulled on Colombia's inequalities very very strongly in ways like it did in much of the developing world, of course, which is much more unequal than much of the developing world, and so people have seen him as being really unable to fulfill his promises and almost unwilling, high-handed, especially when these protests broke out last year, which really were huge. They shut cities down. It was partly about non-implementation of the peace deal, partly about a stagnant, what they see as a stagnant economy or an unequal one. And so these issues were never really resolved. People see him as being unable to fulfill the mandate he was given.
I see where you're competing with probably somebody shares your apartment, so you're doing very well.
This is an active newsroom. We've got a news crew about to head out and film the election coverage today, so you might see some of that going on in the background.
Excellent. Okay, so but those protests, you talked about high-handedness. That the protests were dealt with in a particularly violent way. 24 people dead.
Yeah, according to some estimates, 24. It could be higher. Some people are still missing from those protests. Of course, that's not to say they were, disappeared by police or state forces or something, but the number could be higher. It's terrifying.
Got it. Yeah, and that was critical. Then that was damaging. That was particularly damaging for him.
The protests, yeah, well, they were very much damaging in that the protests in Colombia are not uncommon. The marches have come about every 6 months or so, and called by unions who are always feeling, left out of the economy in one way or another, or left out of fair negotiations, etc. But what these protests did a year ago, which was really quite groundbreaking in Colombia's recent history, is that they brought in different sectors of society. So you suddenly saw, instead of it just being the working class or the kind of the complete unemployed people who live out in the displaced people who live out on the edges of the cities, this really drew in the middle classes and some sectors of the upper classes as well. It was much more society wide. And as I say, that's because instead of just, these protests, the trigger, the catalyst was an unpopular tax reform that was going to raise the price of VAT on eggs and things like that. But that then grew into a wider kind of howl of outrage about inequality, about not funding education, healthcare during the pandemic, not enough not enough access to credit for small businesses, violence in the countryside, violence in the cities, and so it grew to being like kind of a wider howl of outrage, a society-wide one, which is which of course is much more debilitating because it made it hard for the government, which though obviously the government changes every 4 years, Colombia's usually gone between centre-right and hard-right, and usually what happens in these protests is they say, oh, well, it's just a bunch of left-wing guerrilla FARC sympathising agitators. It's a lot harder to do that now effectively because of the peace process. It's much harder to smear a mass of protesters as being FARC sympathisers, when if they really were FARC sympathisers, they wouldn't have to kind of agitate violence in the cities. They could just vote for them. They're a legal party now. So
previously, just on a very broad terms, essentially you had, you either pro the state, centre right or right wing, or you're a revolutionary and with the people out in the jungle ready to overthrow the government. And that's how you would be described if you're on the left. But that you're saying that's changed, and now the debate is really about more everyday issues or fundamental issues that many people in the cities can sympathise with. It's not about revolution.
Exactly. That it's much harder to get that rhetoric to stick now, whereas before it would.
Let's talk about the leading candidate. Sorry, Megan, come in there. Go on. Sorry.
Oh no, and I was just going to say I was thinking about this and remembering talking to 56-year-old woman at the beginning of these protests, and kind of the thing people were saying was just like, we're not scared of COVID anymore. We're scared of this government. And you see like these populations that would previously kind of lean into that rhetoric of fear of guerrillas and like the left kind of being more open and just really challenging that rhetoric in a way and challenging the government. And you just see, and this really leads into this current election, right? As we'll, talk about, but like that the credibility of the right that's always had this stronghold on power is kind of waning. And that is kind of leading a lot of populations that wouldn't normally, vote for one thing or another to kind of stray and look for other options.
Yeah. Okay. What we're going to do in a bit is we're going to look at, because there's so much to talk about. I mean, Colombia is a massive country, and the effectiveness of the state is often called into question. And there's this sort of sense of people living in the cities who are close to the state, and then you've got people live in very, very remote communities who are far away from the center of government. And that brings up all sorts of issues, particularly in an election where if you've got guys with guns out in the middle of nowhere, it's quite easy for them to shape things. So Megan, I'm going to come back to you in a second and talk about that, and also some of the sort of social issues that have cropped up from the peace process in the last couple of years. So we're going to come back to that in just a second. But let's just stick with the election for the moment. Can you tell us about the leading candidate? I mean, we're talking about the favorite, Gustavo Petro, was actually a former guerrilla himself, and I was just reading, but was banned by the centre right or right wing government from standing for office. Joe.
Yes. So Gustavo Petro, who's as you say, was a former guerrilla himself, some 30 odd years ago, and the bogeyman for Colombia's right since the FARC demobilized, really, and a little before then. He first off, well, he's been around the block. He was a fighter in the M19 rebel group, which was to simplify, a center-left rebel group active in Colombia in the 80s, particularly. This was a time when being in a rebel group didn't mean that you were a Marxist, Leninist, or a Maoist necessarily, although there were plenty of those groups too. These were the times when in Colombia, to do politics, you more or less had to carry a rifle. And the M19 was one of those. They had huge popular support. When they demobilized in a peace process that was somewhat held, they, despite a lot of their members being killed in the initial aftermath, but when the M19 demobilized, they co-authored the Constitution, which is today, this was in 1993, and it's the current Constitution. Gustavo Petro, obviously a card-carrying member of the M19, has been mayor of Bogotá. He's, he was the runner-up last time out in the presidential elections. He's the front runner in this one. There's been senators from the M19. So when we talk about the M19 as a rebel group, we're not talking about the FARC, which have a much more troubled history with the drug trade, a much more troubled history with kidnapping. And terrorism, etc. The M19 is a different beast entirely, but still.
What's he promising to do that's going to make him? I mean, what's expected of him for starters? I mean, what's the kind of change that people are expecting from a left-wing government?
People are expecting for a start, people are expecting a fairer economy. They're expecting an economy less geared towards the extraction of fossil fuels, more geared towards making Colombia an agricultural powerhouse. And they are expecting a change in essentially kind of rhetoric and positioning on Colombia's civil war. For a lot of people, a lot of Colombians, especially the younger generation, who were raised during the Plan Colombia years, and seeing a lot of escalation in violence, and a lot of it committed by rebels, a lot of it committed by the state and its paramilitary allies. They're a bit fed up of constantly feeling that the enemy is among us, and therefore we have to go, scorched earth against it. They're warm to the rhetoric of peace, and really, what a lot of people expect. That's how people in the cities may feel, the younger cities. But in the countryside, people just want to feel represented. They want to feel that they're having decisions made with them in mind. Colombia is a vast and massive country. I know Megan's going to talk about that in a bit.
Yeah.
And these people have only a lot of rural Colombia only feels the presence of the state when it's airstrikes and military patrols. Yeah. So they just want to feel like included. And Colombia is a huge and multicultural country, but it so often feels like it's just governed. So
size-wise, what are we talking about? If you get to make a comparison to states in the United States or countries in Europe, or
size-wise, as our friend David, who I believe is watching, likes to say, it is the size of California and Texas.
So it's pretty. That's big. That is big. We're going to circle back to the elections in just a second, because there's some very interesting candidates also that say a lot about the kind of change that might be afoot. And there's one woman I want to talk to, which is that's Petro's vice presidential candidate. Her name is Francia Marquez, who's quite a remarkable person. I'm going to come back to you, Joe, about that in a second. But Megan, I want to come to you. And you're known for getting out well away from Bogotá, getting out to some much more remote areas. And I'm just going to tell a story of our own. When we were doing our first recce in Colombia, we wanted to go to a former FARC area, and I think it was only 40 miles from Bogotá, and it took us 7 hours to get there. The journey was just unremitting. It was just, the roads were terrible. And it just made you think that if you lived in that small community and you wanted to get your goods to town, the roads were shocking, absolutely shocking. So the idea that you could actually sell your goods and make a living, the state just really wasn't there. And that sort of hit us on day one when we first arrived there. I think you've got some photos. I think you can share your screen. We've got a few things that we can look at. You've been to some very remote communities, and some of these communities have been affected by the violence in previous years. So just tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so here is an area of Choco. So kind of what you said, just a bit of context. Colombia is divided between rural and urban. So like Bogotá, Medellin, all of these big cities, you have massive urban centers. And then you have this incredibly massive, diverse country that's really logistically hard to navigate around. So you have a lot of communities that are just, like Joe said, feel really abandoned. So here's an area, here's an example. This area is called Choco, which is in the northern area near the Darien Gap, which made news headlines a few months ago after all of these Haitians were crossing through. It's known to be perilous. But this area—
that's the arm that connects North America and South America. And there's no highway, there's no real mass communication going through there. Is that right? Yeah, it's amazing.
No, and even more importantly, there's hardly government presence in this area. And what happens is you have these fracturing armed groups kind of filling in these power voids. So a lot of these communities transit due to low levels of like infrastructure. They'll transit on rivers. These are activists that are going out to rural areas to help women who are victims of gender-based violence. And you just see like basically it's these civil society organizations that are filling in the gaps, and you have just this feeling of abandonment.
The state's not present. You're talking about abandonment. I know you also look at towns and villages that have been affected by violence over a very long period of time. The civil war in Colombia over 40 years, and significant violence before that as well. What are we looking at here?
This is a town called El Salado, which Joe might know. It's very well known for being one of the sites of the grisliest massacres during Colombia's armed conflict. And there are a lot of towns that are known as pueblos fantasmas, or ghost towns, where everyone in the town fled. In this case, it was paramilitary violence. And they started trickling back around 2016. They started moving back into these towns, but they still feel dead and just completely abandoned by the state. So,
and there's a thought. So, in terms of the rule of law, there's the state and the state's ability to function, whether it's things like education and healthcare, but also in terms of who has the most influence on the ground. And I presume you've still got guys with guns in some places.
Yes. So this is an area that we had to get in and out of very fast, because there have been doctors and lawyers that arrived to this town to do judicial work and whatever, working with these communities, and they will receive a death threat within 10 minutes of arriving. We went with the social leader who recently got her house burned down by unidentified people but she's gotten over 500 death threats from paramilitaries and had to flee. And this is a social leader, one of probably the most threatened social leaders in the region. And it's just another example of what you're seeing. You see, and this is why Colombia has a massive, one of the massive problems with violence is killing of social leaders. And what social leader means, because it can be kind of confusing, like outside the Colombian context, is just like an activist pushing back against armed groups, standing up for people's rights in areas where the state isn't there, a human rights defender, someone pushing back against power in the region, which is not the state, it's the armed groups that live there. So you also have like a lot of this is like a massive context in much of rural Colombia nowadays.
So where's this particular town, and is it in a different area to the one we were just talking about?
Yeah, so Choco's right in the center in the north. This is also in the north. It's called the Montes de Maria, which is also a key sector for things like illegal gold mining, arms trafficking. It's historically dominated by paramilitary groups and gangs. It's an area that has a long legacy of violence, and there was a hope in 2016, and it did get better even before that, due to like Plan Colombia, honestly, and a lot of really strong arm tactics by the government. But then you see long term how that affects an area.
Plan Colombia was the government basically military campaign against the FARC and in the run up to before that, the peace agreement. And just bringing things back to the elections, you were recently in Catatumbo with somebody running as a candidate down there, and they ran into pretty much the same problem you were just talking about in terms of their ability to campaign was effectively removed from them by guys with guns.
Yeah, so I actually wasn't in Catatumbo. It was just a candidate I'd been talking to and following, and people kept citing this as like cases of violence. And electoral violence in this election is kind of up in the air, because you have one of Colombia's largest guerrilla group just called for a pause or a ceasefire. Thank you. Yeah. During the first round of elections, but I was actually just looking at this organization called Pares, which tracks electoral violence and violence in the country, said there's a violent act committed pretty much every day in terms of electoral violence. It's mostly in these areas. And
the guy you were talking about, I don't know which party he was campaigning for, but he had a state provided bodyguard. He had his sort of election kit with him, and it was an ELN government who basically just disarmed them and said, right, you've got to go.
Yeah, and this is an area, one of the most violence-torn areas in Colombia, today. This is on the Venezuela border where all of these armed groups flock to because it's strategic and advantageous. And again, these if you are running as a alternative candidate in any way, you are pretty much automatically, it's kind of like if you're not with these groups, the people that run these areas, then you're against them, and therefore you face a lot more
Okay, so we're building up layers of context for for me this is a big refresher. If you don't know Colombia at all, I mean there's so many layers to this. Joe, I think the interesting thing here is that usually the refrain is, look, there's violence, we need to clamp down, we need to send the police in, we need to fund the army properly. That's been the response throughout the previous years, and that's not happening. What's been the impact of the pandemic? We talked about it a bit in the introduction here, but what impact has that had on people? How has it affected people in terms of jobs? Megan, I know you've done some work on this too. But Joe, just to start with, and I'll come back to you, Megan, on it, because Megan, I know it's hit women in particular. Well, let's start with you, Megan, then. That's because you've been writing about this. Go on. The effect of the pandemic on women.
Okay. So basically all of these groups, as Joe's established, Colombia is a deeply unequal place. You have, and these inequalities stretch between different things. You have class, race, the urban areas and rural areas, deeply unequal. But with gender, it's a massive thing because, historically there have been these inequalities. You have women before the pandemic in more precarious jobs like house cleaners, service industry, working a lot more informally than men. And they've struggled to get back on their feet. The economy is doing better.
So more menial, low-paid jobs, and they've been knocked out basically with the shutting down of the economy. Those jobs have come to an end. They haven't been able to provide for their family, no alternative source of income. And here we are. What's the situation now?
Yeah, I mean, now, obviously people are once again cleaning houses and these jobs are back happening. But what you have is these people were set back for about a year. They got, had no income. A lot of them are pushed into debt. Or just in a lot more precarious situations now. And that's not just women, right? This is poorer populations in the country that are now looking towards this leftist candidate, which we'll talk about, or just different alternatives. It's because they got hit. A lot of them got hit so hard economically by the pandemic. And that's honestly why the Paro, this massive protest that happened a year ago, also happened because it got triggered by a tax reform bill that would essentially, add taxes on
instead of getting the support, more taxation, which is the sort of possibly the reverse of what was happening in more developed economies that were throwing out and giving out cash.
Yeah.
Joe, can you? Sorry. Yeah, Joe, tell us about Francia Marquez and what she's promising. Where does she fit in this?
So, Petro's vice presidential pick, Francia Marquez. Megan just told us about social leaders and how threatened they are. She is one of those. She's from rural Cauca, which is one of the most conflicted, violent provinces in the near
Cali, southwest.
Exactly. Yeah, and exactly southwest near Cali in the Andes, and it's hugely conflicted because it's where a lot of coca is grown, the base ingredient in cocaine. It's on a trafficking corridor because you can get to the Pacific Ocean from there, and there's also a lot of gold mining, legal and illegal, going on there too. And so and Francia grew up there, and she grew up in a community that was, as is kind of the history of a lot of rural Colombia, constantly at odds with a massive extractive multinational, in this case, a gold mine. And her campaigning against the gold mine for community rights, environmental rights, etc., led her to be threatened many, many times. She's kind of dodged
Just to spell it out, essentially there are armed groups that are aligned with the mines or the farmers or whoever the big economic interest is. I mean, that the two go hand in hand. And I'm not trying to sound like a sort of Marxist revolutionary. This is true. The two do go hand in hand.
Well, and I would add in that we don't know it's necessarily armed groups, because there's a lot of evidence and studies that show that, like, for instance, for most of the cases of attacks against these individuals, it's not known, which sometimes means, or hypothetically could mean, that a company or this larger interest pays a sicario, or, and it's not necessarily the government's go-to is to immediately blame this like larger armed group, but oftentimes it's a lot more microscopic and complicated than that.
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you. The other significant point, Joe, is that Francia Marquez she's from a very poor community. She's a woman as a leading candidate, and she's Black.
Exactly, and that really is what's so historic is the sense of representation that she offers to people who have felt ignored for centuries. I mean, the Afro-Colombians make up about 10% of the population. They were, brought as slaves to work on sugar plantations and in the gold mines starting in the 16th century, when the conquistadors had already killed most of the native populations with the diseases they brought with them. And since then, Black communities have felt completely marginalized and outside of Colombian politics. And to a very, very large extent they have.
It's particularly striking when you visit the presidential palace and you go in and you see all the former presidents, and they are all basically white men, and many of them come from the same families, and those families have dominated politics for the past century.
Exactly, and so I was at a campaign event with Francia at the weekend on Saturday, and she went to Cauca, this province where she's from. She went to one of the bigger towns there, and held quorum with various community leaders, and then gave a big kind of retail politics on stage speech. And I spoke to a bunch of people from there, and I spoke to people of all ages, mostly Black or from rural farming communities, what they call campesinos, like peasant farmers. And they all said this is, and of all ages, and they all said this is amazing. It's amazing that someone from here, someone who looks like us, that speaks like us, is getting so close to actual power, and they see themselves, they see her as being part of a kind of soft revolution in how politics is done, because community politics is strong in Colombia. People are often at community level forced into becoming social leaders, as Megan said. And so to see one going from social leader to vice presidential candidate is huge for these people. So I spoke to young girls who in her see, oh, actually, maybe one day I could run for president. And so that is something really quite historic, and which is why we're seeing, her campaign ripple around the world. She's got huge coverage.
Megan, Petro had no choice but to choose her, didn't he? It wasn't something he was necessarily going to do himself, and she's had a sort of meteoric rise.
Yeah, I think the thing about Petro that makes him a complicated candidate is just so like he in 2018 lost the election. He ran against Duque, the current president, and lost. And because a large part of that was just this historic fear of the left and guerrilla movements. Petro was an ex-combatant, obviously not in a group like the FARC that's a lot more troubled, but still, like with a lot of these older generations that lived through the armed conflict, they tend to be more open to this like narrative that's been, championed by the right, that like, oh, if you elect a leftist, the country will turn into Venezuela, or like all of these guerrilla groups will feel empowered and do X, Y, or Z. So there were a lot of like right-leaning Colombians that were just really scared of Petro, or like the concept of electing a former guerrilla, and swung to Duque. And now you have this discontent that's now leading more people to lean towards Petro, but he's still known as kind of a troubled candidate and is in the polls quite popular, but among a lot of populations is still not popular. And I think Francia Marquez is a big part of why his campaign has been a lot more successful than it was in like 20.
But at the same time, reading the political analysis, the pundits in Bogotá, there are questions around Marquez, and they do see her. Is she? The question I see is she going to be able to govern? Can she? Is this somebody who's had office? Those kind of questions, and also seeing her too much as a threat from the left. Well, I'm asking that. I'd love to get some questions here. We've got people watching here who have got a significant experience of Colombia. Some have travelled with Joe, but I know that there's at least one person here watching who's very qualified to ask good questions because he has lived in Colombia and worked in Colombia for a long period of time. So I'd love to get your questions down, even if you're not ready to come and put yourself on the microphone, just to put them in the Q&A box. What about that issue of trust? That does seem to be an age-old thing, Joe. They're from the left. Can you trust them in government?
Well, yeah, that's always the question, isn't it? It's one thing on the campaign trail; it's another thing when you're in office. And coming back to your broader point, can they govern? And that is, of course, always a bigger question in Latin America, where politics gets kind of very log jammed quite easily. You cannot be allowed to govern by some obstinate opposition who favour shutdowns over just disagreement. And so you only need to look at Peru to see what happens when a leftist wins that people don't like in the halls of power. And so, can Petro be trusted? That is a question a lot of the electorate is asking. And one thing, one person we haven't discussed is the main candidate he's running against, Federico Gutierrez, who was mayor of Medellin, who is not from the same political party as Duque, but is seen as a very close ally of that political party, and he's out there hammering this message every day. Yes, Petro can promise a lot right now, but Hugo Chavez in Venezuela promised a lot in 1999, and now Colombia is dealing with 2 million Venezuelan refugees fleeing the Bolivarian revolution that Chavez started. So whether or not people trust him or whether he can be trusted is an issue.
Gutierrez or Petro? Who are we talking about? Gutierrez or Petro?
We're talking about Petro in terms of whether he can be trusted to deliver, and whether he'll be allowed to govern freely. Should he win, of course. I mean, yes, the polls say he's the front runner, but polls have said a lot of things over the last sort of 5 years that haven't necessarily come to fruition.
Okay, there's some other interesting candidates I'd love to talk about too, but we've got a good question coming up from Howard. Howard, do you want to say what you did? How long have you lived in Colombia for? How long have you had experience in Colombia for?
I worked in Colombia, as you said, Nick, about 30 years ago, and I've been going back to Colombia about 6 times a year, though not in the last 2 years since then. It won't surprise you to learn that most of my friends and colleagues are sort of in the centre-right in Bogotá, and many of them, as you will guess, are from the extractive industries. And so they have a slightly different perspective, although there's very little that I disagree with what the two panelists are saying. I mean, certainly amongst the middle class means something different in Colombia, but in what we would regard the middle class, there is a real fear of what would happen to the Colombian economy and society if Petro were to get in. And just as Joe, I think, said, there is a fear that, yesterday Venezuela, today Colombia. So there is a sort of hope, certainly amongst my friends, that given the fact that this is a 2-round election, and that therefore, although it's pretty much certain that Petro will win the first round, that probably, but not necessarily, there'll be enough people who, in the end, will then unite around the compromise candidate, Federico Gutierrez, and he having the advantage that he isn't, at least from one of the sort of families that have together pretty much ruled Colombia for the last 50 years. So from what I can see of the opinion polls, but obviously Joe and Megan are much closer to this than I am, the implication is that in the second round, at least as things at the moment, Gutierrez will win by about 3 percentage points.
Okay, that's the margin of error, isn't it? Very close run thing. So do stay with us, Howard, because I value your input here. Megan, what's your take on that? What are the polls saying? Could it be that close?
I think it could easily be that close. And I come from a context of, I haven't always lived in Bogotá. I lived in Medellin for like 2.5 years. And this is like kind of the hub of this thing called Uribismo in Colombia, and this traditional power and right-wing narrative, right? And you go to Medellin right now, and every single poster, everything you see is all Fico or all Gutierrez. And I think it speaks to a larger point, which is that we should be quite hesitant with the polls. Colombia, you never know what's going to happen, whether it be protests, elections. I think that Petro, so I think a lot of people, again, are very, very keen on this business message, but now there's less of a trust in that narrative, partially because Duque employed that same narrative about creating this orange economy and building up all of these different things and expanding the economy that really didn't.
What does that mean, orange economy? Does that mean the sort of balance between agriculture, mining? What does it mean, orange?
It's essentially, and Joe might have a better detail of this. He's making a face. It's basically, Duque pitched an idea to like build up international investment and just like create a more jobs focused economy. He came from a DC context and basically pitched that, among other things. But basically what we have is like kind of this hesitancy with this narrative that, again, is being employed. But there is a massive truth to, like, if Petro gets elected, like, international investment is probably going to go down. And that is a major question for a lot of voters as well, especially.
Joe, do you share that? I mean, I was thinking that no government worth no sensible government in Colombia is going to do away with the extractive industries in a time when they need the income.
No, I agree there. I don't think any sensible government would do away with extractive industries anywhere. Actually, like from one day to the next. And he, I mean, you know, I must have the disclaimer that I am in the very privileged position of being neutral and not having to pick a dog in this fight. But yes, people are worried about his approach to extractive industries. You know, Colombia is a petroleum exporting country. It is its largest export by far. Colombia is also kind of it's the economy is growing. It's not necessarily growing any fairer, but it is growing, which people are worried they're going to lose. And you know, I've spoken to a lot of people. I was in Medellin last week. And as Megan says, like a lot of people are worried about what could happen if Petro were to come in. I heard people saying they're going to send their kids to universities abroad because they're worried that everything will go down the tubes here. Which of course, it did occur to me that normally, if people, when governments are as scarily socialist as people might say Petro's would be, education is the thing they fund first. So you have a few years to actually get them educated here before everything then goes down the tubes and get them to Miami. But yeah, people are worried that rejigging the system, which has been Colombia's been stable. This is the thing. Colombia has been politically stable. It may have not been perceived as being fair by its own people, but it's not. There's not been coups. There's not been kind of mass uprisings that have destabilized the economy hugely. It's always been the contract security. You know, even though there's been rebel
with
groups.
The instability next year, is there a suggestion that the left needs to sort of say, well, hang on a second, when we don't want to go down the same route as Venezuela, we're not trying to propose that? Are they trying? Is that something they're trying to fend off, Megan? Is there a sense of we're meant to be different?
Well, and I was just going to add on to Joe's point a little bit, just like it's very unlikely that Petro really makes some massive change just due to the construction of Congress. The Congress is split right now, which means he's basically not going to have, he's going to have to struggle to get anything passed, to put it lightly. But I think Joe made a very good point regarding like stability and whatnot. I think kind of how a lot of Colombians view it is like, and just across Latin America, like there has been historically this fear in countries like Colombia of like, if we go with the alternative candidate, what could happen? You have a lot of countries that can change on a dime based on who's elected or the political movements of the day, right? And Colombia has been fairly politically stable, but it's very easy to go with the same political movement just because you've had it and it's the country's not going to fall apart versus like an alternative candidate, which can be a toss-up. But if you actually look at the construction of like Petro's politics, he's already been in high positions of power, like Bogotá. I think the larger question is like not like, oh, is he going to radically transform this country and turn it into Venezuela? And more, how much will he actually be able to get done due to like Congress? And that's the same question with like Gutierrez, for example.
As we've got just over 10 minutes to go, and I want to move away slightly from the elections, talk about some other issues with Colombia, talk about the FARC as well. But just before I do that, there's one other very well-known name candidate running in this election, and that's Ingrid Betancourt. So, Joe, just remind us about her. I think most people remember her as being taken hostage.
Yes, Ingrid. I'm not muted, am I? Ingrid Betancourt was obviously a senator in 20, 30 years ago, and was kidnapped by the FARC and was held for was 2 years, I think, a while in the jungle, and was rescued in this kind of massive kind of Hollywood-esque operation. She since then she's actually more divisive than you might think in Colombia, and much more unpopular than you might think. She was quite critical of the military raid in which soldiers died to rescuing her, of how it went down. And she then moved to Paris and, kind of lobbed her grenades at whoever's in power in Bogotá from there. She ran as she's running. I say she ran somewhat dismissively, I realize, because her campaign is dead on the I'm looking at an opinion poll here, and she's apparently predicted to get 1% of the vote, whereas people that are going to vote, what they call voting blankly, vote to explore their ballots, is 6%. So she's probably not going to do very well. She's got
name recognition, but not a chance in hell of getting any progress on the election itself.
Exactly. People see her as just she's just not very popular. She wasn't a popular senator. She's seen as being a very wealthy, out of touch Colombian who is kind of using her story to attack all sides without really offering much new.
Okay.
She doesn't excite anyone.
Joe, in a second, I want you to talk about Haiti. We're going to get a bit more. We're going to jump back from Colombia and look at a few other issues in the region. But before we do that, I want to share a picture here. This is from a story that Megan, you were working on. And this really is a sort of a post-conflict issue. This relates to the FARC. When we were in Colombia, we met with Jesus Sanchez. Is that right, Joe? Santrich, sorry, yeah, one of the top 4 leaders of the FARC, and I was particularly struck by the group of people we met there. They were actually being guarded by the people who would have been hunting them down beforehand. In other words, the sort of secret police were outside their sort of headquarters in Bogotá, and the peace process, the discussions are still ongoing. Santrich has actually since gone back into the jungle, seeing that the peace process wasn't standing up to what was being promised. But amongst the people there were groups of young women, and I think some of them were pregnant then. And here's a story, and then that perhaps we didn't pick up on, but Megan, you've been looking at in some detail. What are we looking at here, and what are we writing about?
Yeah, so these are FARC guerrillas, and this photo was taken by my reporting partner, Juan Arredondo, who I spent a month reporting this story with. Basically, what you have is the peace process is signed in 2016, and you have all of these FARC rebels. And to say the vast majority of them on the lower level were just like poor people in the rural countryside that were caught in the crossfire of war, didn't see any opportunities for themselves, like a lot of the same issues we're talking about now, and picked up arms and joined the FARC because it was the only opportunity.
That's what you did, yeah.
A lot of them, especially higher ups, committed war atrocities, but like a lot of the lower level were largely like soldiers in this war. And basically what happened, the peace process is signed, and all of these guerrillas who've been fighting against the government for decades in the jungle try and reintegrate back into society. They were not allowed to have kids. And basically what you saw was a baby boom. Finally, now we can construct this.
So the expectation was peace, some way to have a living and have a family.
Yeah. And now you are seeing the same thing repeating over and over. When you talk about Colombia and these decades of conflict, often what you're talking about is generational trauma, right? These are kids, these ex-combatants are now kind of living in limbo in reintegration camps in rural areas. They're getting targeted by armed groups or XYZ, criminal organization. They're kind of a larger metaphor for like many of the failures of this peace process. And kind of what you see is this trauma and this violence.
So I don't get quite. So the expectation was that you get some kind of reintegration, that'd be economic integration and opportunity. Yeah. I mean, your piece in particular was about women who are getting pregnant, having children. But sorry, what's wrong with that? What's the issue?
It's basically that, these kids are getting, in these camps, they're not able to reintegrate back into society. A lot of people are picking arms back up again because they just, don't believe in this peace process. They're getting targeted. It's more economically viable to join an armed group that pays you.
So the reintegration never happened. The promise that when they were disarmed and they taken to these camps, that just didn't take place. And then you just got conflict being regenerated. And
now these kids that were supposed to be this symbol of peace, of this future they're going to build, are getting pulled into all of these incredibly complex dynamics and this generational trauma of conflicts that is now kind of continuing on in Colombia.
Joe, does that matter to people? Do people care about what's happened to the FARC and their reintegration? Is that really an issue that's just so marginalized it doesn't appear?
I mean, it's an issue. People care about it. It's not everyone's number one issue in terms of what they're going to vote based on, but absolutely the reintegration is a thing people are very much concerned with on either end of the spectrum. And I think you observed when we were here in 2017. You predicted, in fact, that from your experience reporting in the Balkans, that if reintegration, when it's done, when you take a combatant group and you just basically keep them in isolation as they reintegrate, that can present problems down the line, and those are those problems that Megan saw.
That piece is in the National Geographic, and we'll share that with everyone. I don't know if we can put that. I'll try and put that in the chat line so people can see it now. So everyone can have a look at that. Sorry to cut you off, Joe. I do want to talk about Haiti before we go. We've only got about 5 minutes left. Your remit is bigger than Colombia. Haiti had a coup, and who was behind it?
Oh, well, no one actually knows, and we're all wondering if we will ever know. It's been over a year since the president of Haiti, Jovenel Moise, well, it should have been nearly a year. Sorry, I should say it was July last year that he was gunned down in his bedroom in the presidential mansion in the hills of Port-au-Prince. In circumstances that remain murky, we know some of the gunmen were Colombian veterans of Colombia's war that, with low pensions, often find themselves entering into the murky world of international mercenaries. We don't know exactly who ordered the hit. We don't know exactly who funded the hit. We do know that the last thing Haiti needed was more instability, such as a massive power vacuum after a president is gunned down and there's essentially no legitimate government left to take the reins. So, yeah, Haiti had a year, and it's still having one. In July last year, president is murdered. In August, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake rocks the southern peninsula. Thankfully, not as catastrophic as the 2010 one in Port-au-Prince because it wasn't such a densely populated area, but still over 2,000 people died, tens of thousands of homes destroyed. And then in August, we see, so that was in August, and in September, we see mass deportations from the southern border of the United States. Of Haitians back to Haiti. Most of those Haitians hadn't lived in Haiti for many years. They'd been working in construction things in Brazil and Chile, but then when the pandemic turned their fortunes down, they tried to migrate to the States and found themselves back in Port-au-Prince, but further destabilizing that country. And then towards the end of the year, we saw an uptick in kidnappings, in kidnappings for ransom at stoplights, culminating. The one that got the most headlines was 17 American and Canadian missionaries kidnapped from a bus, Mennonite missionaries kidnapped from a bus, and then they brazenly escaped a couple of months later, which is crazy.
And
Joe, are you writing? Are you covering Haiti for the Times? Are you covering it for the Guardian? Who are you writing
for? The Guardian. For the Guardian, yeah. So I've been covering Haiti for the Guardian. I was last there at the end of last year. Unfortunately, security issues there have just made it very, very difficult to move around. And it's also, when countries are as dangerous, they're also prohibitively expensive, for which is one of the problems, which is why these places become kind of news vacuums.
Yeah. I wanted to mention it really because of the Colombian angle, and that's the legacy of guys with guns ready to go and fight for anyone's cause.
Soldiers of fortune.
Indeed. I think it's thank you very much indeed, both of you. It's been a good overview. I feel it's such a complex place. I know we've only skimmed the surface, but it's also a symptom perhaps of the difficulties that are going to be affecting many developing countries over the next 18 months, 2 years or so, as we hit these sort of economic storms ahead. and many of the issues that Colombia is facing has been similar to across the region. Thank you both very much indeed for your time. There, we're going to leave it. We're going to look at the talks for the rest of the month, and I'll give you an idea of what's coming up next month too. But my thanks in the meantime to Joe, Parkin, Daniels, and also to Megan Janetsky. Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks a lot.